Today's sermon is entitled Fruit Inspection, and we're going to be mostly in Matthew, the 7th chapter. And of course, Matthew, the 7th chapter is Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is winding down in Matthew chapter 7, and he is letting us know what things are going to be like in the kingdom. Now, as you read through the Sermon on the Mount, he keeps saying over and over again, you heard it say, but I say, on things like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And what he was letting them know is things are changing from the way they've always been to the way they're going to be now. And the transition is going to be one where you could fake what your service to God was. See, if you go back into the Old Testament, everything was physical and it was very specific. I want this lamb, I want this goat, I want this turtle dove, I want you here. If your ox falls in my ditch, this is what we do. If my ox falls in your ditch, this is what we do. And you could do everything that was prescribed without ever caring. You could do everything that was prescribed without it penetrating your heart. And that's why in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is talking about not looking on a woman to lust, because that was adultery in your heart. Not having that thou fool in your mind to your brother, because this stuff was going to come from the inside out. And what it was going to do, it was going to produce visible fruit. Now in Matthew chapter 7, I'm trying. There we go. Verses 16 through 20, the Bible says, you will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? A good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Now, he ends by saying, therefore by their fruit you shall know them. He starts this little section of the Sermon on the Mount by saying you'll know them by their fruit. And he ends by you'll know them by their fruit. Now remember, this is the same sermon that contains judge not lest you be judged. Now in that, Jesus was telling them don't raise the standard of judgment. And now Jesus is telling them what? You got to be honest about what is happening. Now in this Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter, we read 16 through 20. If we'd have read 15, he's warning them about the false prophets that would come. And he's telling them to be these fruit inspectors, to be people who can look at the fruit that is there and decide, is this good or is it not good? But today I want us to turn it on ourselves, because we're very good at inspecting everybody else. We're very good at looking at their fruit and their production and saying they've got to step it up. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. But the only person that we can change is who? Well, for me, it's myself and my kids, which I have total authority over. I just keep telling them that. But as I see the sand going out of the hourglass of these kids being my responsibility, I realize this: they make more and more choices for themselves. And it's less and less about what Dad says, and what I hope they do is what have had a change on the inside that's going to produce fruit on the outside. In Matthew chapter 7 and verse 16, we're told there's an expectation. The expectation is this, that you'll know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Now, if you remember this quote, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. It was from a commercial. I believe it was for car insurance, and it was three very mature women sitting around, and there was a lady, and she just kept stapling pictures to her wall like it was Facebook. And one of her friends said to her something that she didn't like, and she said, I unfriend you. And she said, that's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Now, we're sitting there watching the commercial and saying, that poor, sweet, grandmotherly old lady just doesn't get how our modern day technology works. But we need to realize that Jesus came preaching the Sermon on the Mount to explain to us how being a Christian was going to work. And how a Christian was going to work was that we were going to be expected to be fruit producers, that there was something that we were supposed to do. Now in Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, it says, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, he will also reap. For he who sows to the flesh will also reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Now, when I lived in North Carolina, I had a couple friends, and one of the things that they did for a living was they cleaned seed and they sold it. And I was over looking at their operation, and they was showing how sophisticated it was. Everything had a barcode on it. It was scanned in and scanned out. That way that it was not just known that you got so many of this kind of seed, but you actually knew what each person had. And I was a little floored by how much technology was involved in this. And I said to him, what would happen if I flip-flop some of the stickers around? Out there's a lot of peanuts and a lot of cotton. What if you just flop the seeds around? Now, I'm sure that a seasoned farmer might pick up on it. But maybe some city guy like me just decides he's going to farm, and he goes out and he plants him some cotton, and all of a sudden what? The peanuts start coming up, and you're a little shocked. Well, that doesn't happen to someone who knows what they're doing. Why? Because what you plant is what you're going to get. Now, I found this quote. This is supposed to be a very, very famous quote in the Hispanic community. Don't expect mangoes when you plant papayas. It's supposedly something that mothers generally say to their children when they have done the wrong thing and then are shocked that they're getting punished for it. It's like, no, you can't go get the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, and think that you can't, or that you're going to be rewarded. Now, it was amazing the other day. We've had the flu run through our house a little bit. That's not amazing. The amazing part was that I called the school because your kid not showing up is not enough notice that they're not coming to school. And so I call and I say, which kid's not coming? And what I got back was, oh, now they're not going to have perfect attendance. And I laughed and said, well, they didn't have perfect attendance before. And they said, well, we're not going to count those days that they missed. And I was thinking, well, perfect attendance was something different when I was a kid. I never had it, but I could have had it if I went to school today, because it was just whatever days we're going to count. Oh, not those. Perfect is going to be less than. And we've just kind of watered down perfect attendance. Now, I'll tell you something, Todd. Something that your mother doesn't want you to know is that I've been out of high school for forever, and no one has ever come up to me and said, hey, did you have perfect attendance in the 8th grade? And it's good, because the answer would be no. But if you miss a day of school, you shouldn't expect to get what? Perfect attendance. You know, over the years, the kids have gotten little awards. When Jude was little, and I still have it, it was an award for the best attitude in the whole grade. And I think, oh my goodness, North Carolina was in trouble, because they ain't dished that out to him here in Indiana at all. They don't allude to it. They don't say, we wish every kid had the same mouth Jude did. And I'd say, well, that's because he got it from me. But Jude got a citizenship award, and every once in a while one of them would get Student of the Month, which I think is drawn randomly out of a fishbowl, because my kids have won that. And when I do, what I have is I have the kids all in the living room, and you got one kid who's doing what? Holding. Look, Daddy. Look, because that's what Jude says at 17. Look, Daddy, I won Student of the Month. And then I look at the other ones and I say, well, where's yours? Didn't win Student of the Month that month. But then I have to tell them, we love you all the same, even if you have not come up to our expectations of our hopes and dreams, and you've let us down, we love you the same. See, we take the standards down. And when we take the standards down, guess what? We don't start expecting that we are going to get what we've planted. We don't expect that there's going to be something that we're going to pay for when we don't do it right. And the Bible keeps stressing the fact, don't expect spiritual when you plant physical. You can't run this race, this life, with a physical mindset, with physical goals, with physical potential. You can't go through life trying to make these physical attributes the most important thing in your life. And at the end, just sit back and say, you know what, I want a spiritual reward. You can't move in a physical direction and end up in a spiritual place. In John chapter 14 and verse 3, Jesus has his disciples sit down for their last little meeting there. It's their last little meeting, and they are, Jesus is about to go out the garden and pray, and he's getting ready to go to trial, and then he's going to go to the cross, and he sits down and he tells them he's going to leave. Starts out the chapter by saying, let not your heart be troubled. But in verse 3 of John chapter 14, he says, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. Now, you think about this, Jesus is giving them information that he's leaving. They're very confused in their plan. Thomas is about to jump in, and he's about to say, Lord, we don't know where you're going, and we don't know the way. Now, remember what Jesus said, follow me. That was his first calling to them. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, they're down fishing. Comes along and says what? Follow me. Because if they follow him and he's on a spiritual mission, headed in a spiritual direction, guess where they're going to end up? They're going to end up where he's at. See, that's the difference in trying to figure this out on our own and saying, I'm going to live the way that I want to live. I'm not going to have any expectation of how I'm supposed to perform. But at the very end, I'm going to make a U-turn and I'm going to be where Jesus is. Does not, absolutely positively, does not work that way. Jesus said, follow me. And if we do, we end up where he is. Now, there's a rule here in Matthew chapter 7, verses 17 and 18, that is set in stone. And that rule is, even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. A bad tree cannot bear, or a good tree can't bear bad fruit, nor a bad tree good fruit. Now, you think about this. This is a lot to take in, because at first it seems like common sense. But what makes a good tree, and what makes a bad tree, we find out here is in what we produce. In what we produce. If we produce the good fruit, then the vine dresser is going to look at us and say, what? That's a good one. If we produce bad, we're just going to be labeled a bad one. There is no exception to this rule. This is the words of Jesus. Good trees, good fruit. Bad trees, bad fruit. Now, we get that when we're examining everybody else. When we're looking at everyone else's fruit production, when we're looking at what they do, we get, oh, you must be bad because you're producing bad. But when we look in the mirror and we take a long, hard look at ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, am I producing good or am I producing bad? I love the old phrase, the old statement is comparing apples to oranges. Because we do this a lot, we try to compare two things like they're the same. Now, since we moved to Indiana, especially with Jude, we've been in this whirlwind of hoping that he graduates from high school. But graduating from high school in Indiana required different things than it required in North Carolina or in Missouri. And so we get here, and how in the world is this kid going to graduate? Because he's wasted his time taking classes in North Carolina that nobody cares about here in Indiana, and missed out on what Indiana required. And so we're running through all these different hoops they want us to jump through, and when we get to the end of, we're right down to the wire. I was into school the other day, and they said he's going to make it because they're going to take this for that and that for this, and they're trading everything, and Judah's just sitting there just wanting them to cut him loose and let him go. And the guidance counselor said, we've had a lot of trouble with that. She said, some of the new standards require that some work be done. You have to have a job. But they will accept their sports as if it was a job. Now, I want you guys to roll that around for a little bit. Can you imagine somebody walking into Metal Fab saying, I want a job, and Les looking at them and saying, do you have any experience? Say, 8th grade volleyball. 8th grade volleyball. It's like, we're sorry, but you're overqualified for that. Kind of apples and oranges. We sometimes expect that we're going to stand before Jesus and we're going to give an account of the things done in the body, and we're going to want to talk to him about how we lived a physical life, and him to do his Jesus magic to turn it into spiritual stuff. But we have to realize we can't spend a life producing bad fruit only to have Jesus change it into good fruit. Jesus is looking for us to do what? To produce right now. James chapter 3 verses 11 and 12 says, does a spring send forth fresh water and bitter water from the same opening? Can a fig tree, my brethren, bear olives, or a grapevine bear figs? Thus, no spring yields both salt water and fresh. That means we start doing the fruit inspection on ourselves and say, I got some rotten fruit in here. Don't expect that we're going to find the good fruit. Don't expect that we're going to look through and say, well, I've spent a lifetime of producing really bad fruit, but surely it's come from a good place. Jesus is setting a standard that says we have to start expecting something out of ourselves. That means Christianity can't be a spectator sport. That Christianity can't be somewhere where I try to find power or I try to find my will. It has to be somewhere where I've submitted to God to do what? To be production for him. Now, this is one of the things that I hate for people to say to anyone. And this is 2 weeks in a row I've untied my shoe. And Josh, I need you to hit play there at the top again because I sat down. This is just not going well, all right? Ever since I found out Josh Bowser learned a memory verse, I've just been stunned. My mind has been blown. I hate for people to say you can be whatever you want when you grow up. Yeah, have you ever heard someone say that? Because it really doesn't work that way. If you're 5'1" and uncoordinated and you want to be a professional basketball player, somebody just needs to give you a hug. I mean, that's just what they need. You need to be pushed to what? To your potential. To your potential. Now we need to ask, what do we want to be when we grow up as a Christian? Because as a Christian, what we're supposed to be when we grow up is trees that produce good fruit. Now, we were talking in our leadership class, and one of the qualifications for an elder is to have a good reputation from those on the outside. And we talked about the fact that that qualification is not, I don't have a bad reputation on the outside. It's that I have a good one. Because in the middle there is what? No reputation. There's also the, not too good, not too bad. No one's impressed, but nobody is really turned away by it. The qualification is a good to have a good reputation from without. We need to be people to just say, well, I don't cause any trouble. The first church that I left, the last day that I was there, there was a couple named Chuck and Alberta. Chuck and Alberta talked to me and Rebecca, and they asked one question. Since we've been here, have we done anything? Guess what the answer to that question is? No. Now, their goal in that was what? Didn't do anything bad. But the answer was no, they didn't do anything bad. They didn't do anything good. They didn't do anything. The gist of their Christianity was they came into a room and breathed. That was it. But what was Jesus looking for? He was looking for fruit production. He was looking for us to grow up into something that would be usable. Now, here's the part where Jesus, sweet Jesus, who loved us enough that he was here to die for us, really gets down to the nitty-gritty with his statements here about a tree and its fruit. In verses 19 and 20, he says, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by your fruit, you will know them. Now, Jesus went through this, know them by their fruits. Good trees, good fruit. Bad trees are going to produce bad fruit. There's no exceptions to that. And this is what I think bad trees, we're going to cut them down and get rid of them. Now, we in 2019 live in a place where we have to accept everyone for just who they are. And what's Jesus say? I don't play by that rule. These are my people. Remember, these are people like we talked about during Sunday school that have volunteered to be in the vineyard. We want to be his servant. We want to be a part of his mission. And he stands back and he says, what? I want fruit and I want good fruit, or there's no place. Now, you talk about getting your feelings hurt. Can you imagine reading some of the letters that were written to the churches when they were written to? I mean, every time I read the book of Galatians, I think, well, that was a nice Sunday morning. Where he gets up and, it's like, well, we've got a birthday invitation from Nellie. And bring no gifts. Oh, and Paul wrote something, and he says, I think I've wasted my time on you. Who bewitched you that you shouldn't obey the truth? You keep biting, you're going to devour each other. That gets a little personal. When Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he named names. Can you imagine sitting around and that being read? Can you imagine just sitting up there and like, well, you know what? I've got a few things against you. A lot of hair envy on Mark Bowser. Everybody over there looking like, yeah, he comes in here, think he's better than all of us every week. Can you imagine how uncomfortable it would be to have your name named? And know that that was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Can you imagine, though, if you're really doing that honest self-examination on yourself and asking, am I being productive for the kingdom? Or am I just something that Jesus says there's no place? You're not doing what you're supposed to do. Now, what we think about or should think about is the potential that Jesus counted on growth. He counted on production. It wasn't just, well, I'm here and it's all about Jesus and it has nothing to do with me. Listen, Jesus got us to a point. He saved us by his grace so that we could what? Do good works. So that we could be faithful to him. So we could be obedient to him. And he expects from us. Now, I want us to think about this. In John chapter 16 and verse 15, Jesus has 11 guys on top of a mountain. And he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Right after this, he ascends up into heaven on a cloud, and these 11 guys are told by an angel that what? He's going to come back in the same manner. What has essentially happened is Jesus has said, go out, share the gospel with the whole world, and I'll meet you right back. Do you think that Jesus' plan was that when he left, he'd come back and hopefully have 11 followers? What his goal was those 11 followers would go down the mountain and make disciples. And part of making them disciples would be what? Teaching them to make disciples so that when Jesus came back, it wouldn't be 11 guys twiddling their thumbs on top of a mountain saying, we didn't do anything good, but we didn't do anything bad. Jesus was expecting that what he did was going to turn into something It was going to mean something, and the way that was going to happen was he took his mission of seeking and saving the lost. He took his position of being the light of the world, and he handed it to us, and he said, what? Go do something with it. And I'm going to come back, and when I come back, my goal is that none should perish, but all would come to repentance. But I'm going to lay this burden on you. Go produce the fruit. That kind of puts us in a place where we really have no excuse. We can't really find a position that says, I don't have anything to do. In Matthew the 25th chapter, we have just went through the parable of the talents. And Jesus has had that 5-talent guy, and what's he expecting out of him? He's expecting that he's going to take those 5 talents and he's going to go get 5 more. You got the 2-talent guy, he's got 2 talents, and God is looking at him. His expectation is produce 2 talents more. He's got the 1-talent guy, and I have to believe that he's expecting that when he comes back, what's he going to have done? Produced another talent. But when he doesn't, the Lord's reaction to him is, you wicked and lazy servant. And then he tells him what he knows. You know that I reap where I have not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. Where I grew up in Ohio, there are a lot of these Indian burial mounds. Now, they're Native American burial mounds. And people will go and look at them. Now, let me describe them to you. It's a big hump of dirt with grass growing on it. It looks just like the field it's in, except it's not flat. You can spend a total of about 17 seconds there before you've taken the whole thing in. Everyone on the planet will say that that is where the Indians buried their dead, and also would bury certain artifacts and things that they thought needed to go to the spirit world or wherever with the dead, except for the Mormons. The Mormons believe that those are the tombs or the graves of the giants that came down here and fought after Jesus came and shared the gospel here. And part of the thinking behind it is that if Jesus didn't come to North America, then we can never be expected to be obedient to the gospel. The problem with that is that Jesus expects to reap where he didn't sow. We read through and we find out that Jesus spent his time here, his adult life, in Judea and in Samaria and up in Galilee. He hardly strayed away from that at all. But what was his plan? To save all of mankind. And why? Because he had these guys he brought around with them, and he expected them to go plant and for him to get some harvest where he never physically laid his feet. Do you know that the things that we open our Bibles and read, there is so much of that we don't have one word of Jesus ever saying it? He got those guys ready to say it. I'll take these 11 guys and I'll send them out. And what I'm expecting is that they will produce fruit and that they will produce fruit. What I want us to do today is to take that long, hard look at ourselves. Because this is what we know, that we can know them by their fruits. And if we can know them by their fruits, we can know ourselves by our fruits. We know the rules, that fruit is expected, and that good trees produce good fruit and bad trees produce bad fruit. I had a guy tell me one time that he had been to 10 different churches, and every time he got there was problems. And he said, I don't know why trouble follows me everywhere I go. Now, I was sitting there looking at trouble. She was standing right beside him. And I knew that she loaded him up in the car every time and took him with him. And I kind of thought, if everywhere we go, we find physical, maybe it's because we're not heading in the direction of spiritual. Maybe if in every situation that we get ourselves into, we find ourselves in some sinful, spiritual, or physical battle, maybe it's because we need to make a little turn and head towards the spiritual. If we look at our lives and say, this is what I've produced. I've got all these physical accomplishments, but no spiritual accomplishments. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of tree am I? Now here's the good news. Good trees, they have to produce good fruit. Bad trees, bad fruit, and bad trees get cut down and burn up. You get to decide what kind of tree you are. It's not that Jesus is unfair. He gives us the choice. What kind of tree do you want to be? You get a harvest in this life. You get to decide, is it a physical harvest or is it a spiritual harvest? And that is determined because you reap what you sow. Today, what I ask is that you take a long, hard look at yourself and ask yourself, what kind of tree am I? Not what kind of tree do I want to be? What kind am I right now? And it's very easy to know. We're going to stand, we're going to sing our hymn of decision.